Crime Syndicate is the story of Earth 3, a world where superheroes are actually supervillains, and they've taken over the world in order to run it like a crime family, as opposed to the Justice League that protects the humans of Earth. Now, the series so far has been somewhat of a mixed bag. It's supposed to be introducing us to the characters of Earth 3, but instead of doing any sort of introductions really in the main story, the introductions are in the backup stories, which for the most part are fine, except the one for Ultraman is really dumb. But the rest have been okay. It's just that it would have been nice to get some more character introductions and story pieces in the main story, instead of having to rely on these backups that are coming out issue by issue, meaning some of these characters you're not really familiar with, and you won't be until the end of the limited series. But now that we're in issue 3, we see the resolution of the first arc. And in this arc, we see that Starro has come to Earth in order to subjugate the humans. Now, this, of course, is the first story of the original Justice League. So, it makes a good parallel to take the original Justice League introduction and origin and make that the introduction and origin of the Crime Syndicate. And it's also pretty interesting to see how this world is different. One thing that's somewhat questionable is the fact that this world seems to be set in a fairly modern time period, as if this whole universe of superheroes just sort of happened. Now, I know that DC is pushing its infinite frontier, and there's this whole idea of the multiverse being saved and reborn and rebuilt and whatever coming out of Dark Knight's Metal, but I feel like this story would have been better served set in the past, years ago, before all of the modern technology and modern stuff going on, so that you could have some time between the time in this story of their origin and maybe a future miniseries. As opposed to, it feels like, for some reason, this universe of Earth 3 just now got superheroes. It's a bit of a nitpick, sure, but it just seems like they didn't think it through. Like they just felt they had a new series to produce, so they just came up with these new characters for the Crime Syndicate. But the story of Starro is one that is familiar to a lot of longtime DC Universe fans, and it plays well in taking the expectations of that original story and switching things around for a more violent and evil alternate universe. One of the biggest problems, though, is that this team decides to come together and work to defeat this villain for the basic, very, very thinnest of excuses, because they want to control it, is what it seems to come down to. Ultraman has this idea that he wants to save the world, but basically because he thinks he's the only one good enough and strong enough to do it. Owlman wants to save his city, but he doesn't really seem to care about the rest of the planet, so he doesn't seem to have a lot of motivation to be on this team. Characters like Johnny Quick, we don't really know anything about, and he really doesn't seem to have much of any motivation to be involved in this story at all. Donna Troy, on the other hand, it turns out she's been subjugating the United States President, Oliver Queen, and so any attack on the United States is technically an attack on her and the power that she's gotten from taking over the United States and using the president as her own personal puppet. But even then, she could easily just walk away and let it fend for itself and take over some other country. Maybe because she feels she's ultimately threatened, but it just doesn't feel that satisfying. We do have an Alexander Luthor of this world, but again, we're not really told anything about him. He has a green mech-powered suit, much like the Lex Luthor of our world, but he's also just kind of an idiot and is really inconsequential. Donna Troy has a magic lasso that looks like barbed wire, which is interesting, but we don't know anything about it. And in fact, even when we get her origin in the backup story of this issue, we're not told anything about it. So there are some neat things that are happening here, and I think there are some fun ideas with mixing the expectations of these characters you're familiar with and turning them into villains. But overall, I just don't think they've thought everything through enough or really developed it enough to make it into a must-read story. It's certainly interesting and better than the current Justice League story that you can get from Bendis, but that doesn't mean it's great. It's a fine time waster, but it's nothing fantastic. The artwork in the main story is from Kieran McCowan with inks by Dexter Vines, and I'm sure I've butchered Kieran's name, but the artwork itself is fine, it's serviceable. There are some times where it stands out as being pretty good, but there are other times when it's just serviceable. I think when he's given opportunities to draw Starro and some of the big monster scenes, he does a very good job. But when he's drawing some of the characters, like Ultraman when he's in a violent rage, or Superwoman when she's fighting for her life in this big battle and she's overcome with all the emotions that she's using to turn on her opponents, it just sort of falls apart. His ability to render facial expressions is okay, but it's not great. And it doesn't always work the way I think he thinks it does in his head. It doesn't come through on the page as well as it probably should. Now, maybe that's a byproduct of the inking, and maybe they don't work together so well as a penciler and an inker, but overall, it's serviceable artwork for the most part, but it's not something that you're going to look forward to or look back on fondly, necessarily. Now, the backup story, on the other hand, is done by Bryan Hitch, and he's handling the penciling and inking himself. And of course, that always looks top-notch. It looks fantastic, but it's only a few pages. Again, he's just doing a backup origin so that you understand where the character is coming from, and that's all you're getting. So, while it's, again, fine and serviceable, overall, it's not a great artistic package. In a bit of a surprise, this book actually gives you a couple of extra pages of story for $3.99. Now, we know that $3.99 has come to be the current industry standard price, so there's nothing really exciting about that. The main story is 18 pages, so it's 2 less than the standard amount you're expecting. So the backup story, you would assume, would only be 2 pages to make it 20, which is going to be the standard comic for DC and Marvel these days. However, they've given the backup story 4 pages, so you're getting an extra 2 pages of backup story. So for the $3.99, you're getting 22 pages instead of 20, which DC has been defaulting at. Now, are those 22 pages worth your $3.99? Well, that's really going to depend on how much you love the Crime Syndicate. Do you really want to read about Earth 3? If so, then hey, great. Here's a couple extra pages for the same price, and you're going to get a little bit of extra for your money. But if you're really not someone who's invested in the alternate Earths of evil superheroes, maybe this book really isn't the best investment for you. So overall, I can't give Crime Syndicate number 3 a blanket recommendation for everybody. It's not a great book on the stands that I think everyone's going to enjoy. I don't think it's one of the best books on the market. Now, it's certainly better than some of the other books that DC is putting out right now, and if you're pretty desperate to try to find something to read because of how horrible books like Superman and Batman have turned into lately, then this may be just the type of thing you're looking for. But if alternate Earths really aren't your bag, and evil superheroes aren't the type of thing you're looking for, then I just can't point you in this direction. Other books on the market right now, like Man-Bat, are much better books about bad guy super beings that are more worth your time than a book like this. And it's a shame, too, because this was one I was really looking forward to when they announced it during the whole Infinite Frontier push in the new DC universe. But the execution just leaves a lot to be desired.